Mardle presents Taken, written by Michelle Pearson with Eve Hatton, and read by Penelope Freeman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Mardle. Foreword. Michelle's story is a deeply private tragedy. It is a story of loss and enduring pain after her son was taken from her and placed for adoption in 1972 because she was unmarried. Social and parental pressure combined with the expertise of the authorities steered Michelle towards adoption as the best course of action for her and her son. Aged just 16, she complied. This book is more than a story of just that moment. The anguish of her decision and the impact it has left on her life leap off every page. Equally compelling is Michelle's reunion with her son and rebuilding of her life with him and his family. Michelle's story is also part of a public scandal, the story of tens of thousands of mothers having children outside of marriage. The same pressures and judgments were applied, pushing for the adoption of their children by normal families being in the best interests of everyone. Choice was illusory. Any hope of Michelle keeping her son would have been surrounded with shame and stigma. The anguish Michelle felt was never felt by the authorities. The lifelong impact dismissed. Her story provides unique and compelling reasons why this needs to change. Dr. Michael Lambert. Valentine's Day, 1972. Standing at the door of the day nursery, I hold my breath, as if, by doing so, I can freeze this moment in time forever. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be upstairs in the dormitory I share with 3 other girls, packing my few personal belongings into a bag. I'm going home this afternoon. Home. Back to normal life. Though how can life ever be normal again after today? Glancing around to make sure no one's watching, I slip through the nursery door and there he is, my son, my baby, Tim, in his crib just inside to the left. I gaze at him in absolute adoration as he sleeps on fresh white linen. He's dressed in a white layette to match, pristine and new. His sleeping face is serene and beautiful. His peach-soft cheeks were made to be stroked. He looks like an angel from a storybook, and every time I see him, my heart seems to grow a little bigger. I didn't know my very being could be so connected and intertwined with another's, or that I could love someone this much. Though it's cold outside, the pale winter sun streams in through the nursery windows and warms my face as if to comfort me. Much as I long to, I can't pick my baby up and cradle him in my arms. I didn't put him in those bright white clothes. They're not for my benefit either. My baby has been dressed for his own journey away from this place and away from me. At any moment, a social worker will arrive to take him to a foster family. I don't know where he'll be going after that. It's as if a sheet of glass has already descended between us, and all I can do is press my hands against it and whisper, "Goodbye, my darling son, my baby Tim. I love you. I love you so much. I want to stay. I want to hold you close and never let you go." I want to call out in pain. This moment taking me back to a memory of another girl leaving while I was still pregnant. Her cries of anguish echoing up through the house as she was physically dragged away from her child. In my moment of goodbye, I share the same agony. I will turn and walk away with my own cries of anguish, the only difference being that mine are held deep within me where no one but me can hear them. With one last look at my baby Tim's sleeping face, I force myself to step away. The words of Sister Dolores echo in my mind. "Go away from here and get on with your life, Michelle. Just forget that you had a baby. Remember you are doing the best thing for your child." She's right. I am a bad girl. I'm one of those girls. I'm not a real mother, so I'm doing the only thing I can. I'm doing the best thing. I'm giving up my baby so that he can have a better life without me. I'm sorry, I whisper one last time. I hold my pain deep in my soul and do my best not to scream in despair as I leave. Stepping out into the corridor on that cold February morning, holding back tears no one will wipe away, I'm sure I'll never see my son again. Chapter 1. This is a story of love and loss. The loss of my baby, the loss of my innocence, the loss of the life I might have had stolen from me, taken and buried in a culture of corrosive secrecy that led to decades of shame and self-doubt. It's a story that's still unfolding, as 50 years on from the day I gave up my son for adoption, new fragments of the past continue to come to the surface. Even in the course of writing this book, I've uncovered long-hidden facts that might have changed everything had I known them in 1972. But that year, I was just a 16-year-old girl, facing the might of centuries-old social and religious institutions with very clear ideas as to how someone like me should behave. An unmarried mother should not keep her child. But it wasn't only the chance to be a mother that was taken from me the day I said goodbye to my baby Tim. To give you a sense of how much I actually lost when I gave up my son, it's perhaps best to start with where I came from. I was born in the summer of 1955, as the United Kingdom bathed in a glorious heatwave. My arrival a month earlier than expected was greeted with much jubilation. My father was a flying officer in the RAF, and his aircrew were determined that my birth be properly celebrated. Dad's crew were like brothers to him. They all knew how much he'd longed for a family of his own, so on the day of my birth they took him out on the town, toasting my mother and me in every pub on the high street. They sang and cheered as they walked along arm in arm. There was no doubt that everyone involved agreed my birth was something to sing about. "You're a dad, blessed with a baby girl." I imagined Dad at the end of the raucous evening, stumbling back to his married quarters on the RAF station with a huge smile on his face, already making future plans for his much-wanted baby daughter. What would I grow up to be? Would I be an artist or a scientist, an academic or someone with practical skills? Whichever path I chose, he was sure I would make him proud. Every new parent has great hopes for their first child, but perhaps my parents had greater expectations than most. From the outside, Mum and Dad were the quintessentially English-sounding Mr. and Mrs. Pearson. However, their family name hid a complicated history. It might have been wonderful to be welcoming a new baby in the English summertime, but their lives so far had taught them that things weren't always so easy, so uncomplicated, or so happy. Dad was Polish. He was conceived and born during the 1918-1919 Polish-Ukrainian War. His family lived in abject poverty, and he was an unwanted child. As he grew up, malnourishment affected his development and stunted his growth. He would talk of only having shoes in the winter months and of his 5-mile daily walk to school. In 1939, when the Soviets and the Nazis carved Poland up between them, Dad joined the Polish army. He told me that in the spring of 1940, he had witnessed the notorious Katyn massacre, in which more than 20,000 Polish officers and members of the intelligentsia were killed upon Stalin's orders. Soon after that, Dad was captured by the Russians and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Siberia. Conditions were brutal. They left him starving and weak. Then in 1941, Germany invaded the USSR. The Soviets joined the Allies, and with the support of Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, the Sikorsky-Maisky military agreement came into effect. In August that year, amnesty was granted to Polish citizens, and POWs were enlisted to Allied forces. Dad was enlisted in December 1941, ready for evacuation to Iraq. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for him. I know that in the labour camp he had developed night blindness, nicknamed chicken eyes, as a result of chronic malnourishment. This meant that every day once the sun went down, he was blind until the following sunrise. How did he manage to survive making the journey to the Middle East, already so weakened? Many thousands died. In May 1942, Dad arrived in Iraq. In September that year, he was one of a group of 220 recruits transferred from the Polish Army to the Polish Air Force, destined to join the RAF in England. The Devonshire took him by sea to Karachi, with onward travel several months later, first to Bombay, India, and then to Durban in South Africa. As he set sail from South Africa, little did he know his life was to be threatened again. On March 13, 1943, his ship, the Empress of Canada, was torpedoed and sunk by an Italian submarine. Dad spent almost 4 days in the water before being rescued by a Royal Navy destroyer. Approximately 400 people died. Dad told me he was lucky. When the ship got hit, he was covered in engine oil, and this formed a protective barrier between him and the cold, salt water of the Atlantic. Nevertheless, when he was picked up, he was unable to stand up, as his bones were so weak. After a short period of recuperation in Freetown, he finally arrived in Liverpool, disembarking from the Mauritania at the end of March 1943. This was the start of a new chapter in Dad's life, filled with danger and courage. After completing his radio operator training in July 1944, he was assigned to 18 OTU for his flying training with pilot flying officer Kozuba Kozubski. I mention him by name, as after qualifying, this crew moved to 300 Squadron, part of Bomber Command. Between 27th November 1944 to 25th April 1945, they completed and survived 30 missions together. The life expectancy of the air crews of Bomber Command was often brutally short. They looked death square in the face every time they took to the air. Dad told me he once returned from a mission to discover that he was the only man from his Nissen hut to have survived the night. I often wonder if this was 2nd March 1945, when records show the heavy loss of 14 members of his squadron. That hut, full of empty beds, must have been a heartbreaking sight. Post-war, Dad was commissioned in the RAF, where he stayed until retirement at 55 years of age. His flying career in a multitude of plane types including Wellington, Lancaster, Halifax, Dakota, York, Britannia, Valletta, Varsity and Hastings took him all over the globe, including into several post-World War II conflict zones, and to the nuclear tests at Christmas Island, known as Operation Grapple. For a while, he was also assigned to RAF Northolt as part of VIP qualified aircrew. After completing close to 5,000 flying hours, he moved to air traffic control until his retirement, at which point he retrained to become a plumber. My mother's journey to life as Mrs. Pearson on an English RAF station also began in Eastern Europe. She was born in Estonia. Her family were comfortably off, owning a shop, a mill, and possibly dressmaking or tailor-related businesses. But like Dad, Mum saw her plans for her future ripped up by the war. In 1940, Estonia was occupied by the Russians, and later in 1941 by the Germans, before reoccupation by the Soviets in 1944. During the German occupation, around 6,000 ethnic Estonians were killed, in addition to around 1,000 with Jewish heritage. Mum survived, but was taken to Germany. I know very little about this, where she went or what happened to her. She only talked about working in a German household, and later living on her wits with 2 other young Estonian women. All 3 were passing as Germans and carrying false papers. No mean feat, given that one of them could not speak German at all. They had to pretend she was deaf and mute. On the 13th and 14th of February 1945, Mum was in Dresden as it was bombed by UK and American forces. Estimates of civilian casualties vary enormously, with some sources citing 25,000 to 30,000. By all accounts, it was apocalyptic in nature, with the bombs creating a firestorm. I have no idea how Mum made it out alive, or indeed how she travelled away. Thankfully, by the end of the war, she had moved northwest and was in the British occupation zone. I can only surmise that Mum came to the UK on the European Volunteer Worker (EVW) scheme between 1946 to 47, which specifically asked for women as domestic workers in hospitals and other institutions. I have a vague memory of Mum describing her first job in the UK as a hospital cleaner. The scheme paid £24.06 as a settling-in allowance, issued a ration card and clothing coupons. Board and lodgings were provided in hostel-type accommodation. EVWs were denied formal refugee status, yet classed as suitable immigrants. They were constantly under threat of deportation as their work permits were subject to annual renewals based on satisfactory service. What a fragile and vulnerable position my mother and other EVWs were in. Formerly classed as aliens under the 1905 Act, they also had to report to the police if they changed occupation or address. And there was hostility towards them from the local population, as EVWs were seen as a threat to jobs and levels of pay. It's hard to fill in many more details. Neither of my parents spoke much about their wartime experiences or dwelled on the hardships they'd experienced. Mum in particular was very firm about it, telling me if I asked, "Yesterday is in the past. You can't change anything about it, so why talk about it now?" It was an attitude she maintained her entire life. I did, however, manage to glean that Mum met Dad while she was working as a housekeeper at a hotel in Eastbourne. Dad was there on leave from a government service role he had been recruited for some time after the end of World War II. He was involved in various Cold War operations, roles which were only ever undertaken by single men. It is no wonder that they were ready to let off steam during their R&R. He and his friends were trying in vain to ride a tricycle while under the influence of a few too many beers. Mum was not impressed, but somehow it brought them together. After all the fears my parents had faced during the war and the frustration of their youthful hopes and dreams, it's perhaps no surprise that they desperately wanted to settle down and to build a normal life in England. However, this presented a challenge for them. My father's government service role precluded him from getting married. He had already had to anglicise his surname and agreed to cut off all contact with his surviving family members back in Poland. Having an Eastern European wife would have put him at risk, and the service was adamant. They were not to be married. Thankfully, my father persevered, and after much difficulty, agreement was reached, and my parents had their wedding. It was at this point that my father was transferred to the regular RAF and commissioned with the rank of flying officer. While extremely proud of their heritage, they wanted to be as British as they could be, to become established members of the society they respected, and to embrace its culture. Both my parents were starting their life together in Britain in vulnerable positions in the face of potential hostility and unfavourable attitudes. Post-war attitudes had shifted away from Poles being brave and courageous allies. My mother was already used to hostility. They were soulmates and wanted to do things properly. They wanted me to grow up as a solid UK citizen. Dad also wanted me to grow up as a good Catholic. Despite the many moments in his youth when it must have seemed as though God had forgotten all about him, he was a staunch Catholic. Having been raised in the strict Lutheran Church, Mum had abandoned Christianity during the war and become an atheist. As I understand it, in order for Mum to be able to marry a practicing Catholic, my parents had to seek agreement from the bishop, and Mum had to agree to any children being christened and raised as Catholics. The fact that I was given not one or even two, but 4 Christian names in honour of my grandmother's and earlier female lineage underlines how much I was expected to carry the family history and create a future of which my parents and their forebears could be proud, a weight which would prove very heavy on my young shoulders. Chapter 2. Unlike many fathers in the 1950s, Dad was very involved with looking after me when he was at home, giving me bottles and changing my nappies without complaint. The challenge was that being aircrew, he wasn't very often at home. Though he had some time off to be with Mum and me immediately after my birth, he was soon away on detachment again. Dad might be sent anywhere, UK or overseas, and a detachment could last for several months. He must have spent quite a bit of my first few years away, because my mother often told this story from when I was around 3 years old. Apparently, she and I were walking down Chichester High Street together, when I suddenly started calling out to every man we passed, "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Having not seen my father for a while, I couldn't remember clearly what he looked like, so I decided I would just keep asking until I found him. My mother was very embarrassed. What if people thought I didn't have a father in my life? Mum was a respectable married woman. The last thing she wanted was for people to think she didn't have a husband to go with her child. As a young girl, I was what you might have called a handful, and I kept my mother on her toes. On one occasion, when she and I were in the garden together, I ran back into the house and locked the door from the inside so that she couldn't get back in. No matter how she coaxed and threatened through the letterbox, I would not open that door. Mum obviously understood the danger of my being alone in a house full of hazards like the stove, the fire and the stairs. But it was all just a great game to me. On another occasion, as we were moving house to a place I didn't think much of, I ran away from home. While the removal men and my parents were unloading the van, I gathered a few of my favourite toys under my arm and was off down the road before Mum could catch me. I would often hide from my parents, enjoying their exasperation as they hunted high and low to find me. I didn't sleep much, and when I was awake, I was always full of energy. I was bold and cheeky, and I enjoyed being the centre of attention, the apple of my father's eye. 4.5 years after I was born, my sister Christine came along. I was very happy to be an only child, and did not greet Christine's arrival with enthusiasm. When Mum showed me my new baby sister for the first time, my first words on the subject were characteristically blunt. "Take her outside, put her in the dustbin, put the lid on and put a stone on the top." I obviously felt usurped. I was no longer the centre of my parents' universe. I did not want to share. It was not long after Christine was born that I started school. I loved school from the very first day, quickly settling in and making friends. But just 3 weeks into my first term, we were on the move again. Dad was to be posted to Singapore, and we were going to join him. Poor Mum had to pack up the whole house on her own while looking after 2 small children. I didn't make life any easier for my parents. Having taken one look at the needles laid out in readiness to give me the jabs we needed to be able to travel overseas, I bolted from the GP's surgery and had to be chased up the road by the doctor and Dad. When we arrived in Singapore, the house in Changi where we were to live was not yet ready, so we were temporarily housed at the legendary Raffles Hotel. The glamorous colonial-era hotel, which looked like a gigantic white wedding cake, was a paradise compared to our house back on the RAF station in England, and I loved the month we had there, spending my days happily jumping in and out of the beautiful swimming pool. Unfortunately, my extended holiday had to come to an end with the start of term at the RAF school at Changi. Though I'd enjoyed my first experience of school back in England, I was so outraged by the idea that I had to go to school again when I could be playing in the pool that I refused to go. I had to be carried there by one of my father's RAF colleagues, including through the hotel, kicking and screaming all the way. Once in the classroom, however, I soon settled down again, enjoying the routine of mornings in lessons and afternoons off, happily back by the pool. My first report from the RAF Children's Primary School in Singapore declared me pleasant, cooperative and conscientious. That must have been a big relief for my parents. In Singapore, Dad continued to practice his Catholic faith, but for the first time I learned that Dad's religion was not the only one. Having heard a group of children singing beautifully, I wanted to join their choir. However, this particular choir was affiliated to the Church of England. When the choir master asked me about my faith, I assured him that I was definitely C of E, and he believed me. My parents agreed to me joining, as nothing had been said about the choir's religious affiliations, and I kept quiet. All went well until after a performance when my parents were waiting to collect me. With the vicar standing outside among the choir members, I quickly hid behind another singer. I'm not sure how I thought I would get away with this, as at some point I had to go to the car, and my secret was out. Mum might have found it amusing that I was pretending to be a Protestant. She was still very much an atheist, but I'm sure Dad did not. Singapore was also a time and place for me as a 5-year-old to learn a harsh reality of life. Every week a children's film would be screened by the side of the RAF pool, and before the film we would play bingo. I got off to a good start, and for several weeks in a row I came home with a prize. Then one week my numbers didn't come up, and I came home empty-handed. I sobbed my little heart out, not really understanding how this could be so. I genuinely believed that every week meant a prize for me. One day, I think it was in 1961, when I was coming up to 6, my father went to work expecting to join a crew flying on an exercise, as he had done many times before. Mum thought nothing much of it. I'm sure she was busy with my sister and me, until a breaking news bulletin on Forces Radio announced that the plane our father was scheduled to join had gone down, with every crew member lost. How shocked and scared Mum must have been as she gathered my sister and me together to tell us the bad news. How alone she must have felt as she gently told us we would never see our daddy again. But the news had barely begun to sink in when our father walked through the door, still very much alive. For some reason, Dad's commanding officer had taken him off the crew that boarded the fatal flight that morning. It was a last-minute decision that saved his life. The air crash incident was not the only time in my childhood that it seemed we were going to be a one-parent family. During that same period, our mother had to be flown back to the UK as an emergency for treatment for an illness that was probably cancer. My sister and I were not told the details of her condition, but I distinctly remember being told that she was going to die. It seemed there was no sugar-coating these things in the 1960s. It might have been a generational thing. Thanks to the war, Mum and Dad's peers were used to taking loss on the chin, and my parents had perfected the art of the stiff upper lip. Perhaps it was because of our mother's illness that I was sent to boarding school at the age of 9. Due to the nature of RAF life, I had already attended 3 or 4 different primary schools by then, getting used to making friends quickly, then moving on and starting again with a new set. However, my parents had never before considered actually sending me away to school. 9 years old might be considered early to begin boarding now, but according to my family, it was what I wanted, and I was keen to go. Mum and Dad felt that it would be good for me to have some continuity of education too. The RAF must have paid my fees in order that Dad could keep working while Mum was not well enough to care for Christine and me. I know my parents could not have afforded for me to be a boarder otherwise. The convent of the Sacred Heart of Mary in Hillingdon was extremely posh. I boarded weekly, going home for the weekends. Every Friday afternoon the car park was full of smart new cars as parents arrived to pick their daughters up. There were big Bentleys and rollers, shining as though they'd been driven straight from the showroom forecourt. My father's old Volkswagen Beetle must have looked very out of place. I've only good memories of my time at the convent of the Sacred Heart. I was eager to learn, and my termly reports echoed those from Singapore. I was a polite, helpful and happy child. One teacher even called me ladylike, which if you knew me is extraordinary. We had lessons in deportment and elocution to polish up our social skills. I was great at maths. I was a pleasure to teach and enthusiastic and eager to learn. The only possible problems were that I was occasionally disorderly in my work, and in 1966 was bottom of the class for the state of my handwriting. But I was a model pupil and a model daughter, living up to the expectations of my teachers and my parents, who could not have been more pleased. This was also a time when I found myself in hospital. I had been born with a squint that for whatever reason was not dealt with until I was 10. I don't remember it affecting me in any way, at least not in terms of being teased or ridiculed by others at school. I was used to being away from home, but this was different. I had no idea what was going to happen to me. From my mum's illness, I knew that hospitals were places you went to when you might die. These days, I expect children are prepared for what's going to be done to them. Back then, I'm not so sure. Years later, my parents would share a story of my hospital experience with amusement. Apparently, it had taken 6 male medics in the hospital at RAF Halton to hold me down and keep me still enough for whatever was being done to me. I must have been terrified. Back at school, my father's academic expectations for me were always high. During conversations we've had as adults, my sister Christine has said that growing up 4 years behind me, she did not feel the same pressure to succeed academically. Mum and Dad's ambitions for her were more orientated towards her raising a family. It's ironic, then, that I saw Christine as a goody two-shoes, who liked nothing more than to sit quietly reading or doing her artwork, while outside school I was always in trouble for exploring. I loved to be outdoors. I was always pushing boundaries. Christine would just smile when I got into trouble. In the 70s, a television series called The Good Life would sum up the difference between me and my sister. I was Barbara, always up to my knees in mud and with straw in my hair. Christine was the tidy, refined and elegant Margot, who looked at Barbara with incredulity. It was while I was at school in Hillingdon that another sister, Anna, came along. Little Anna was born 3 months premature, weighing just 2 pounds and 1 ounce when she came into the world. She was impossibly tiny, and it seemed there was little hope she would survive. My parents were distraught in the early weeks after her birth. Care for premature babies was not as sophisticated as it is now, and most didn't make it. But Anna did make it. She came home, and we were a family of 5. Chapter 3. In the summer of 1966, I passed the 11+ exam, meaning I could have a place at the local state grammar school. However, Dad's job meant we were on the move again. We had to leave Hillingdon and head west to an RAF station about 7 miles from Bath, RAF Colerne, where Dad would be working in air traffic control, having retired from flying. These days, we think of Bath as a particularly beautiful city, with all those elegant Regency buildings in creamy Bath stone shining in the sunlight. In the 1960s, it wasn't quite like that. When Dad drove us around, I saw for the first time a block of flats, not quite high-rise, but taller than anything I had seen. The Bath stone of the Regency buildings was black with soot, and there were areas that were very run down. I remember being unimpressed, but if there was one thing I knew how to do, thanks to our RAF lifestyle, it was turn up somewhere new and settle in without a fuss. RAF Cologne, where we would be living, was a relatively large station. It had a NAFI store as well stocked as any city centre supermarket, and a sports centre with a swimming pool. It even had its own cinema. The station's housing was divided into 4 estates, on which accommodation was allocated according to rank. We lived in married quarters on the estate for junior officers. We were given a semi-detached house with 3 bedrooms. I had a room of my own, and plastered the walls with posters from Jackie magazine, which was the big teen magazine at the time. I remember having a particularly big poster of the Monkees, an American band formed as the basis for a children's TV show, who soon became popular as musicians in their own right. I also liked Mungo Jerry and the solo artist Donovan. I knew all the words to his songs. I especially liked Catch the Wind and Universal Soldier. There were many children on the station, and there was always someone to hang out with. The station was a great place for children. There was a dedicated playground between the middle 2 estates, which attracted youngsters from all over. We also made the assault course where the RAF regiment trained on weekdays, our adventure playground at the weekends. There was no such thing as health and safety, and we climbed and swung from ropes to our heart's delight, never worrying about the dangers. On Saturday mornings we would go to the cinema for a special children's showing. At home we had a black and white television on which Christine and I would watch The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Doctor Who. I was a great fan of Doctor Who, which appealed to my love of things scientific. With my love of swimming from our time in Singapore, I'd spend as much time as I could in the pool. I also made extra pocket money by looking after people's pets. I remember in particular dog-sitting for a family that had a Pyrenean mountain dog, a huge beast that seemed as big as a small horse to me. Though their dog was enormous, their family car was a Mini, and with 2 children on board there was no room to take their pet on days out too. The dog stayed with me on the station. Having spent the summer settling in, I looked forward to the beginning of a new school term. Instead of the local grammar school, I was going to attend La Sainte Union Convent School, known more casually as Bath Convent. I was eager to get there and start making another set of new friends. Life felt like a great big adventure. Chapter 4. Bath Convent was a girls' Catholic school. The school was private, but it was what was known as direct grant, which meant that the local authority paid the fees of Catholic girls who had passed their 11+ and would be attending for religious reasons, such as I would. It was set in the grounds of the imposing convent of La Sainte Union on the city's Pulteney Road. I remember my first sight of the building, where I would be a pupil for the next 5 years, 7 if I passed my O-levels. It was far bigger than any school I had attended before, a serious place of learning. Here I would get the sort of education my parents had been denied by world events. Having been a big fish in the small pond that was the Sacred Heart of Mary in Hillingdon, I felt a little awed as I imagined joining the pupils here. The Bath convent girls seemed so grown up and sophisticated. On my first day, I proudly wore my uniform, which included a smart maroon blazer. During winter terms, we wore that blazer with a matching skirt, shirt and tie. During the summer, we wore it over a breezy yellow cotton poplin dress. We convent girls were always impeccably accessorized. Felt hat in winter, straw boater in the summer, gloves when we were out in public, maroon in winter and pure white in summer. The nuns would measure the length of our skirts to make sure that we were decent. skirts were not to be shorter than 1 inch above the knee. If a nun with a ruler found that your skirt was not regulation length, she would use that same ruler to smack you hard across the palms. If you'd just rolled your skirt up at the waistband, as we all did at times to look more fashionable, you'd have to roll it back down. If you'd gone so far as to sew your hem up, the hem would be ripped so that the skirt fell to the right length again. We were strictly forbidden from eating while in uniform outside school. Standards were high both inside and outside the gates. For lessons, we were split into 3 streams, named X, Y, and W. The stream named X was the top stream. The pupils in X were considered the most academically gifted, and their lesson options were chosen accordingly. I was in the Y stream, the middle stream, which meant that my syllabus was a mixture of the academic and the vocational. I had to study Latin and needlework, but my real passion was science. As an 8-year-old, I'd proudly told anyone who cared to ask that I wanted to be a lavatory assistant when I grew up. I meant laboratory, of course. Now, on the verge of my teens, I was fascinated by astronomy, often gazing up at the night sky in the hope of discovering a new star. Just as at my boarding school in Hillingdon, I fitted in at the convent from the start, and my early reports revealed that I was doing well academically, even if my written work wasn't always as organised as my teachers would have liked. I was a good all-rounder. I was keen on sport, especially netball and hockey, and played on the school teams. I was always on attack, playing goal-shoot in netball and right-inner at hockey. My cohort at the convent was fortunate that our sports teacher was an early proponent of women's cricket, so we got to play that too. Outside school, I trained as a lifeguard at the RAF station swimming pool, and I became a patrol leader for the guides. I was very community-minded, someone who liked to join in. Though I'd been a cheeky child as I grew up and became a teenager, I always did my best to fit in and comply with expectations of the adults around me. In the 1960s, parenting was very different to the way it is now. Children weren't given room to think and choose for themselves as they are today. Your parents told you what you believed, and you didn't question it. Simple as that. The freedom of the swinging 60s did not apply to me. As a young girl at Bath Convent, I definitely believed in my parents' values. On Sundays, Christine and I went to church with Dad. Mum had stuck by her promise that she would support him raising us in his religion. I even remember having to go to Saturday morning catechism classes when I was not being taught in a Catholic school. I'd been through my christening and then my first communion while in Singapore. At the convent, I completed my initiation into the Catholic faith upon receipt of the 3rd sacrament, that of confirmation. I was well and truly a Catholic now. There's a photograph of me with Dad from around this time. We're both of us in uniform, his RAF, mine school, and we're being presented to a Catholic bishop. I'm gazing up at the tall man in his ecclesiastical robes with a look of absolute awe. Incidentally, Bath Convent is the alma mater of a very well-known Catholic, Anne Widdecombe, the former Conservative MP and Cabinet Minister, famous for entertaining the nation with her clumsy quick-step on Strictly Come Dancing, but also for her old-fashioned views on abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, and the death penalty. As an MP, Miss Widdecombe even supported the retention of ancient blasphemy laws. Her black-and-white views on life seemed to me to sum up the way convent schoolgirls were taught to see the world in the 60s and 70s, and give you an idea of the social constructs that shaped my early life, not to mention the strict moral certitudes that would soon tear it apart. Chapter 5. Moving every couple of years had become a way of life for our family, but by this time my parents decided they were going to do things differently. With the arrival of Anna, my mother had the 3 of us children to look after. My parents recognised that Christine and I had experienced a great deal of disruption to our schooling as a result of following Dad around the world. I was coming to a crucial point in my education, with O-levels looming. I needed continuity. We needed a place we could call home. So my parents bought a house of their own near Bath, so that Christine and I could stay at the convent. Though they had been married for many years, this was the first house my parents had ever owned. To say it needed doing up is an understatement. It was a near-derelict farm cottage. There was no indoor toilet. The bath was at the back of the house in a lean-to shed. Christine and I had to share a room, and Anna slept in my parents' room. My father did a great job of decorating, but with no money to renovate, the house facilities stayed as they were. The whole house creaked ominously when anyone walked across the upstairs landing. It was very different indeed to our nice modern house on the RAF station. I'm not sure I was impressed. It wasn't just that the farm cottage was pretty much falling down. I was disappointed by the neighbourhood too. At the station we'd been surrounded by people. Christine and I could always find a friend to spend time with. Suddenly, we were stuck in a house up a dark, unlit, single-track road with no neighbours. It was especially isolating for us children. Too young to drive if our parents couldn't give us a lift to see our old friends, we had to walk 10 minutes to the nearest bus stop and hope that we hadn't just missed one of the few buses a day. There were some advantages to living close to several farms, however, and I made the most of them. I made extra pocket money by picking potatoes and by helping to milk the cows at the weekends. I also learned to ride by exercising horses. A huge retired shire horse called Lord Snowdon at the dairy farm and several others at another farm, a good long walk through the woods. I was a terrible rider, though, with no control, and one day I ended up going up the ramp into a parked removal van because that is where the horse wanted to go. I still loved to be outdoors, but I was starting to be interested in the typical teenage preoccupations. I was very much into music and continued to pore over the pop star posters in Jackie magazine. I also loved The Champions, which was a new TV series about espionage agents with superhuman abilities bestowed upon them. I was mesmerised by the thought that just maybe this could become a future reality. As I got older, I wanted to be able to go into Bath in the evenings and at weekends, but the last bus back to our hamlet left the city shortly after 6 o'clock. If I wanted to be out any later than that, I had to leave my push-bike at a friend's house at the RAF station where we used to live. The last bus from Bath city centre back to the station left at 23:10. Having picked up my bike, I would have to cycle the 2 miles home through the woods. This was a little scary at times, especially with the owls screeching and couples parked up in their cars. But it was also beautiful on a moonlit night. There was no question of me being picked up at the bus stop by my parents, so unless I was looking up at the stars, I just pedalled at speed. I made the most of every minute I could spend with my friends. School finished at 15:40, but my bus home wasn't until 16:30, leaving me just over half an hour to hang out with the group of teens who had made the bus station their patch. Then I got a Saturday job at Woolworths, which gave me a little more money to spend. I always found ways to earn money to increase my independence. I was starting to test my autonomy at home. Once, after I argued with Dad, he said that from then on, I would have to be in bed at 10 p.m. This new curfew might have cramped my style, but I soon found a way round it. On the first day I was subject to this new rule, I raced home for 5 minutes to 10. At 10 p.m. I was tucked up in bed exactly as Dad had commanded. 5 minutes later, I got up again and headed for the door. "Where do you think you're going?" Dad asked as he saw me leaving the house. "You told me I had to be in bed at 10, I said, and I was in bed at 10. He didn't say anything about me having to stay there. Dad and I were still close. When he was at home, he and I would go to Swindon together to visit the Polish shops there and buy the food he missed from his childhood. Dad loved those trips, which gave him a chance to speak his mother tongue, though I think he was embarrassed that when the shopkeepers addressed me in Polish, they found I couldn't speak a word in reply. It was on the way back from Swindon that Dad and I had a serious car accident. A lorry jackknifed in front of us, driving us off the road. I was sitting in the front of the car. By a weird twist of fate, the fact that Dad didn't have his seatbelt on saved his life. He was able to roll away from the worst of the impact. Meanwhile, I was saved because I was wearing my seatbelt, still optional then, which stopped me from going through the windscreen.